Okay, now I need to listen to Klingon Acid Punk because that sounds amazing. Hello interwebs and welcome. It is time for another Star Trek Lower Decks review. This time Season 2, Episode 3 will always have Tom Paris. And even before I even talk about this episode, before I even get to my spoiler-free section, and then we'll get into spoilers just a little bit later, I have to say the title of this episode is absolutely perfect. Already, I mean, this is already kind of spoiled in the trailer, but this we know is going to be the episode that Robert Duncan McNeil, the actor who played Tom Paris, is guest starring in. We're getting Tom Paris back in Star Trek, which is absolutely amazing. Great cameo. We'll talk about that as we get into the episode proper, but also the title is just a really great play on the Star Trek The Next Generation Season 1 episode, Will Always Have Paris. So just multiple layers, the top of layers here. I love it, I adore it, and that's not even talking about the episode. So like I said, spoiler-free section up front, then we're going to get into spoilers, and I am so pumped to talk about it because, spoiler-free, I think that so far, this might be my favorite episode of the season. First off, this episode addresses one of my biggest criticisms that I had of the show in Season 1 and then the first couple episodes this season, in that we always saw the characters kind of paired off with Boimler and Mariner, and then also Tendi and Rutherford, and this episode actually sees Mariner and Tendi come together and actually have their own girls trip, have their own, experience, have their own adventure, which is really, really awesome. But what I loved even more about this storyline was that not only was it sort of addressing that criticism, it was making that criticism part of the actual storyline and a critique on the characters and a character arc for both of them, as we saw that Mariner and Tendi both kind of addressed that, yeah, they didn't really know each other. And it wasn't just sort of a meta commentary, it was actually brought into their character development, into why they haven't really gotten to know each other outside of the sort of like limited experiences that they've had over the past like season or so. So I really loved that the show was sort of like not only taking the criticism head on, addressing it, but actually making it part of the storyline. That was absolutely wonderful. And then there was also two other storylines going on here, one with Boimler on his own, sort of dealing with him coming back to the Cerritos and the Cerritos not recognizing him. That was a lot of fun, but also sort of dealing with his own character stuff of like not being sure where he belongs. We'll get into that, but that also sort of dovetails mostly with the Tom Paris storyline, which again, great cameo and some great surprises there, even with what was spoiled in the trailer. So really cool stuff to talk about there. I loved that. The only storyline this episode that kind of felt a little bit flat to me towards the end of it was Rutherford's storyline. He is sort of dealing with the storyline of, I don't want to get too much into it because that's a spoiler in and of itself what that whole storyline is even about, but I liked how sort of nonchalant the introduction of the storyline was. I just wasn't entirely sure that I liked how it ended, and I kind of have to get into the spoiler-filled section to be able to talk about that. But overall, this was a really great episode. It addressed a lot of stuff head-on, fixed a lot of my criticisms that I've had with the show so far, while also making it like actually part of the storytelling, which was absolutely fantastic. And then some other great sort of discussions of tropes and character bits throughout that I absolutely adored. Also, one more thing that I am going to mention in my spoiler-free section, but I'll talk a little bit more in a nuanced way in my spoiler-filled section, is we actually get confirmation here that Mariner is actually, she doesn't officially say it, but she sort of infers that she's bisexual or pansexual. She says that she likes to date both men, women, non-binary folks, and other aliens, and that's amazing. Actually, this makes Mariner our first, I believe, openly bisexual, pansexual, however she wishes to define herself, character in Star Trek, main character in Star Trek, which has me very excited. Also, the fact that they do so while referencing non-binary people as non-binary people, not non-binary alien metaphors. Great job there. I have a couple thoughts, even more nuancedly, when we get into the episode proper about that, but overall, it is so awesome that we have a main character of Star Trek who is officially bisexual, and in doing so, or pansexual, and in officially doing so, also referencing and acknowledging that non-binary people are people, not just alien metaphor. Great job on all those fronts. I have a couple other criticisms of it, but we'll get into that in the spoiler-filled section. So, getting into that, if you have not seen the episode yet, go get it. Get on Paramount Plus. I don't know why I'm like shilling for Paramount Plus. I don't care if you watch Paramount Plus or not. Do whatever you're going to do to watch the episode, but I hope you enjoy it, and we're going to get into spoilers. So again, we have another cold open that sort of sets up all the disparate storylines that we're going to get here, with the characters all in 10 forward, or what I don't even know if is it called 10 forward in Cerritos? I actually don't know. It's whatever the Cerritos 10 forward thing is. I don't actually know if that's what it's called. I forget if it's called that. But anyways, we sort of have all this set up. Tendi is sitting with Rutherford, sort of worried about like she wants to get promoted, she wants to be recognized, so she wants to do something for her superior officers. She wants to be able to get that promotion, get that notice, which sets off her character arc for this storyline going forward. We also have Rutherford notice that Shax is back to life. Yes, the character who died at the end of season 1, the security officer, has come back to life mysteriously, and he's just nonchalantly there, and no one seems to care, which I honestly have to tell you, I really loved this setup. We kind of got some inferences and references that Shax might be coming back this season, so all of us were kind of speculating how he's going to come back, and the show just sort of like says, no, he's back now. And it's just sort of referencing the fact that the Lower Decks crew members, like, characters come back in Star Trek and science fiction and comics and all that stuff all the time, but we don't always like have the moment where like the crew gets to sit down and it's like, all right, looks like Shax is back alive. We don't really get that. He's just sort of there and everyone has to sort of deal with it. I love the fact that Rutherford, who was the one that Shax died saving at the end of last season, is the one so bothered with it. And we'll sort of talk about that storyline going forward. But I just like this introduction of just the nonchalant, like, Shax is back. I really enjoy that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into it. But we also get the storyline with Boimler sort of not being recognized by the ship. He also is like getting like a papusa hot, which I guess like is his character trait now, which I really enjoy. So very efficient cold open, sort of getting us all into the different character storylines and things like that. After the cold open, we sort of have our characters kind of shunt off into 3 different storylines. So let's focus on each of them first. Let me start with the one that I kind of like the least, even though I kind of enjoyed its inception, and that's the Rutherford storyline.
I will say the first reason that I really dislike this storyline is the very fact that Shax is back kind of undercuts the emotionality that the season finale really earned. One of the things that I really loved about the season 1 finale is that Shax's death really felt like it had weight and made the show, that even though it was a comedy, feel like it had real stakes and meaning behind it. And it's something that I really loved the first season for, especially with episodes like Crisis Point, which really had some great emotionality to it. And so for this episode to bring Shax back in such an undercutting kind of way is funny, but I do think it in some ways undercuts some of the real emotion that the show actually really did a real good job at earning throughout the entirety of the first season. And while I do think this is funny, and I do think it's really talking about this trope in kind of an interesting way, I do think it kind of undercuts the serious nature of what this show had earned up until this point, which I was kind of a little bit sad about, ultimately.
So Rutherford's whole storyline in this episode is that he kind of really needs to know why Shax is back. He just has this intense curiosity about why Shax has come back from the dead, as all of us would have. And so the first scene that this sort of comes up is Shax is hanging out in engineering, and Shax sort of gets allusions to the fact that he's like come back. He's like, oh yeah, it really ruined me up, but I'm still here to play racquetball. A lot of fun there. And Rutherford's about to just go up and ask, and another ensign asks as well, and everyone gets very upset at this ensign saying, you need to get out of here. That was out of line. Great moment. And also kind of makes me think of like other moments that this has happened, like the PTSD of people coming back. Like Star Trek has always had these moments where characters have come back from the dead, and it hasn't really had all that much like weight because Star Trek has always been very episodic. The only character I can really think of, I'm sure there are others that really had like weight for coming back from the dead, is Culber over on Discovery. So this feels like a very Culber-esque reference to him having PTSD from coming back, which is great. I loved that storyline for Culber in season 1, and I like that sort of being evoked here. I also love the moment where when Rutherford's sort of like sitting like trying to figure out like what happened, we get the scene where he's like imagining all the different Shaxes of like all the possibilities of how Shax come back, and I love the bunch of weird different Shaxes we see. We see like a Borg Shax, we see a Shax that comes back from like the Mirror Universe who just starts yelling mirror 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 mirror, which is the episode that the Mirror Universe is introduced in the original series, and he's wearing that sort of Mirror Universe outfit. Loved that. I think there was like a Lincoln Shax in there was a Shax wearing a Neelix outfit as well. Like all of that was really funny. I was laughing hysterically at all that and all the different ways that characters could come back from the dead. Great little bit there. But then the end of this little storyline comes when Rutherford confronts Shax in the turbo lift and says, I just need to know. And what I liked about this moment is Rutherford sort of shares that the reason he's feeling this way, that he needs to know, isn't not just out of curiosity, but because he feels guilt that Shax died for him. And he kind of wants to know how he got back because maybe the PTSD was Rutherford's fault. And so he's feeling that sense of guilt. And I thought that was a really good character moment. And the resolution of this, though, is kind of what I liked the least. And it took me a little bit of thinking to kind of realize why. The joke was essentially that the upper deckers didn't tell the lower deckers crew why they came back, not out of like, well, we don't care that we're jerks. It's to sort of hide this like dark secret and how terrifying and traumatizing coming back from the dead can actually be. And so Shax shares his dark secret, and Rutherford's obviously traumatized even by the end of the episode, which I think is funny. But I think the reason that it doesn't quite work for me, and feel free to disagree with me, is I feel like it doesn't like, it's not really commenting on a trope all that much. Like the whole idea of a character coming back from the dead, the character's not on the lower decks not being told that, kind of makes sense. But every other time we've seen characters come back from the dead in other fictions, it's not really because of like some dark, mysterious, like deep eldritch horror type of stuff that Shax sort of like kind of alludes to and kind of traumatizes Rutherford. And so it's funny. I like it. I'm not like hating on it. It just, I usually feel like I like the commentary in Lower Decks more when it's like commenting on a trope, and so the resolution here doesn't feel like it's really saying anything about like a trope or having a meta commentary. So I feel like that part disappointed me a little bit. Again, it's not a bad thing. I'm not like, oh, it's awful. It just was like, oh yeah, it kind of works for me, but not as much as it could have. But I did like that it comes out of a true place for Rutherford as a character, like feeling guilt over Shax coming back from the dead. The other thing with this storyline too is, and it's something that I was kind of been noting in the past few episodes, Lower Decks is kind of pushing things back to the status quo of season 1. Like end of season 1, we really had like Boimler's off in the Titan. He's been promoted. Mariner has sort of reconciled with her mother, sort of thing. Shax was dead. Like we had these setups of like these big status quo changing things. And now, while there's some emotional depth to and resonance with all that, with like Boimler's storyline going on here and Rutherford feeling guilt here, it feels like the actual like logistical status quo hasn't changed all that much. I mean, Shax is back now. What does that mean for Kayshawn? Is Kayshawn now not the security officer? We're going to see him come back in future episodes. I hope so. Now Boimler's back as an ensign. And so I feel like this sense of the show kind of like molding itself to get back to where it was in season 1. So I'm a little bit nervous about that now that Shax is back. I've liked every step along the way of how we got here, but I just see the show sort of morphing itself back. I think that's probably my biggest concern. I know I've mentioned it in each one of my reviews so far, so I'm sorry that I'm harping on this point, but it's just the thing that is concerning me most. Again, I'm willing to trust the writers on this. I'm willing to give them leeway on it, but you know, it's just a concern watching it so far. But that all being said, let's go over to Boimler's storyline, the second storyline this episode. This one I thought was going to be kind of everything that I expected it to be from the trailer. Like the whole idea of this is that Boimler has these plates, these commemorative plates, which they released for like a bunch of different Star Trek shows back in the day. Mike McMahon, the creator of Lower Decks, by the way, even tweeted out when he saw the trailer with the plate in there that he was specifically referencing those like weird Star Trek commemorative plates that came out all those years ago. I know the Star Trek ship posting group posts about like the Q plate a lot, is like an inside joke there. So it's sort of referencing that, and obviously Boimler is a big fan of Star Trek Voyager, which he calls Voy, which is a reference to the fact that all of us, you know, Trekkies call like different shows in the Star Trek universe by their abbreviation, like Voy or TOS, as they referenced in the season 1 of Lower Decks. So that was just a great little funny reference there, and the plates reference as well. And Tom Paris is coming on the Cerritos, and Boimler wants to get his plate signed by Tom Paris because he's just a famous guy, which I really love this, because when I saw the trailer, I thought the only like Robert Duncan McNeil cameo that we're going to get of him playing Tom Paris was going to be this plate, and that was going to be the only thing that we were going to get of that. But actually in this episode, Tom Paris himself actually appears on the Cerritos, which is hysterical. And I loved him sort of being like, oh, I'm going to like fire this up, and the crew was like, well, don't send us to the Delta Quadrant. That's really great. But Boimler obviously is having a hard time because the ship isn't recognizing him, and so he's not able to like access certain parts of the ship and everything. That he has a little run-in with Jet, which is nice for a little reminder that Jet's still on the ship and still around. But Boimler decides like, I'm going to do this on my own. I'm going to be recognized by the ship, and he goes through the Jeffries tubes to try and get to the bridge to meet Tom Paris. I loved this whole bit. I think him like getting fumes and the plate sort of talking to him was wonderful, and then him getting all crazy and kind of looking like Rambo and looking like a Kazon was wonderful. So when he falls out on the bridge, Tom Paris is like, oh my gosh, it's a Kazon, which is sort of like a main enemy species from Voyager seasons 1 and 2, and so they have a fight on the bridge, which was absolutely wonderful through all that. But I also love that, again, it comes back to a character moment for him as well, that Boimler is sort of feeling that he doesn't know where he fits in anymore, because you know he's not on the Titan anymore, but he's not being even recognized by the Cerritos. And so I just like that little moment of like, he doesn't feel like he's fitting in. I feel like the arc wasn't fully completed by the end of the episode, so I'm curious to see if they're going to continue with that thread of Boimler not really feeling like he fits anywhere anymore going forward. But it's a nice little starting place for where the character is now that he's back on the Cerritos. So I'm curious to see how that's going to move going forward into the season. But a good little storyline and setup for him. But both of those storylines, both the Boimler and the Rutherford storylines, were sort of backstage to the main storyline of this episode, and my personal favorite storyline this season so far, Tendi and Mariner going off on their own girls trip adventure to kind of like have a moment to like do something together. Again, as I said in my spoiler free section, I really loved that, you know, back in season 1, one of my biggest criticisms over and over and over again was we constantly see Mariner and Boimler together and Rutherford and Tendi together, and there's no really mixing and matching of that. Even the few moments where like Boimler and Tendi were together in one episode, they didn't really even interact with each other. They were sort of like doing their own things. So it was really nice to sort of see an episode that really centered on that. But again, taking it as like, oh, the characters actually being aware of that fact. Like Tendi says, like, we haven't really had a mission together, and Mariner says, yeah, we really haven't. And I love that. I was like, oh boy, am I being directly called out here with my criticisms? Though I know other people have made it too. I was like, oh god, I feel seen. But again, they're making it a character moment, and so they go to this planet to sort of pick up Dr. Ta'ana's scratching post, as it were, the like horny scratching post, which was great. I love the cat jokes throughout all this with Dr. Ta'ana, and it's a chance for Tendi to prove herself. But it's also a moment for these two to work together, and I like that they start like referencing each other. They like, oh, they find out that Tendi likes Klingon acid punk, which sounds like the most amazing and metal music ever. I loved that, and I love there was like a little transition guitar riff in the background to a scene transition from that scene with the Klingon punk battle stuff. It was like a guitar riff version of the Cerritos theme. Loved that. I also like the planet that they were on looked very Free Cloud-esque. When I saw it in the trailers, I actually thought that this was going to be Free Cloud, the planet that we saw in the episode Stardust City Rag over in Star Trek Picard, which I would have thought was cool. It would have been nice to sort of see Lower Decks sort of tie into more modern Star Trek canon. I mean, they directly reference a lot of like Next Generation, Voyager, Deep Space Nine, all that stuff, but they don't really reference much of like Discovery or Picard. Every so often they kind of do, but not really directly. And so if they had visited Free Cloud, it would have been nice to like, oh, that they're actually going to that planet. But again, they also could have been Small Universe Syndrome if they had done that. And so I like that it's kind of another planet that evokes Free Cloud. It looks very similar. We even see a Quark's bar on there, sort of the franchising of Quarks that we saw in the Free Cloud episode. So that was all nice to see. But within this also too, we sort of start to see that Mariner and Tendi kind of aren't completely meshing. And that sort of happens when Mariner sort of drops the scratching post, and then it's kind of Mariner's fault because she was the one playing around with it. And Tendi sort of gets really upset at that, and so they have to go on a journey to try and get the scratching post fixed. So they go to a starbase where they are on a bar, that a guy that can possibly fix up the scratching post for Tendi, but has a lot of money, it costs a lot of money, so they start a sort of game with Nausicaans, kind of referencing the episode Tapestry, where we sort of saw Picard sort of battling Nausicaans, got stabbed in the heart, why Picard has an artificial heart. So they're battling the Nausicaans, really funny moment there where they're sort of playing. But what I also really liked about this moment too in there is that when things start to fall apart and the Nausicaans start to fight back, as of course would happen when they sort of lose a battle, they break the scratching post for one, but also the Nausicaans reference like, oh, you can just use your pheromones, Orion. And I didn't mention this in last episode 2, but it was there as well. There's this constant undercurrent, and it was way back in season 1 too, that like there's this kind of stigma against Orions, that Orions were only seen as pirates, and that's something that Tendi faces regularly, that she faces the stigma of being an Orion, that everyone sort of sees them as pirates, which I think is a really cool idea, and something we even saw is in Starfleet back in Deep Space Nine with this sort of stigma against Nog being a Ferengi, and all Ferengi being seen as greedy, even though he wanted to join Starfleet, and had to have all this like assumptions put upon him because of his race. And I like that kind of coming out here with Tendi and sort of showing her culture as an Orion. There's even a reference in this sequence to the fact that Austin says like, oh, she's using her pheromones, and even Mariner leans into that. It's like, oh, you can just use your pheromones, which is a reference to Star Trek Enterprise. Gotta love the Star Trek Enterprise reference. There was an episode of that show, which a terrible episode, literally awful episode, but it showed that like the Orion women have pheromones that can control men. Again, terrible episode with terrible implications, but I like that that's sort of referenced here, and it also is explained. Tendi says that she doesn't have that ability. She's not that type of like Orion, which I loved that reference because it also explains why we didn't see other Orion women throughout Star Trek, like in short treks or the original series, why they didn't use that power at any point when it would have made sense for them to use those pheromones. So again, referencing Star Trek Enterprise, a terrible episode of Star Trek Enterprise, but actually also fixing a little piece of canon within that, why it didn't make sense that all, Orion women hadn't been using those pheromones at all before. So Enterprise references makes me happy. Fixing canon stuff makes me happy. I'm loving that stuff. Also, like deconstructing Starfleet and tropes like that also makes me happy. Wonderful stuff. But then this sort of comes out in a conversation between Mariner and Tendi as they sort of get off the starbase, and sort of says like, again, there's this stigma against us as Orions, but I kind of have to live up to that. I kind of have to overcome that. I don't have the luxury of making mistakes like you do, Mariner. I love that sort of reference to both of these characters and sort of digging deeper into Tendi. But then they decide to go to Tendi's homeworld, or to a planet where the people that she knows, some Orion, pirates that she works with. And this is a really fun sequence. Is like, I love when Mariner like talks like a pirate. That was wonderful. But also some really great moments in here as well, because again, we get references to the pheromones and like, this is a bad time for pheromones this time of year. But also Tendi sort of showing off like to be in Orion civilization, she has to like be this badass tough person that she really isn't. And Mariner gets to see that side of her, and sort of like laughs about it and stuff. But then, someone calls Tendi Devana, which we know is her name is Devana Tendi, and Mariner doesn't even recognize that her name was Devana Tendi. She thought she just was called Tendi, which again, sort of a pseudo reference of the fact that we all, as people talking about the show, call her Tendi as well and just refer to her by her last name, but her name is Devana. And so I just like that Mariner doesn't know that. Again, meta commentary becoming actual criticism of the show, and them sort of having to escape the situation, get out of there, all really good. And there was this moment where they're escaping, and Tendi has to choose between saving Mariner and dropping the post, and obviously she chooses to drop the post. And they have this really wonderful scene back on the Cerritos shuttle where they sort of reconcile and sort of say, like, look, now we know more about each other. And it just felt very Star Trek, and it's like a good, like, nice, sweet moment where they sort of recognize each other and decided to say, like, now we know more about each other. And it comes down to, like, this fact that Mariner sort of hides the fact that she doesn't let herself be open to making friends because she always feels like she's going to get betrayed and people are going to abandon her. And so this is a big character moment for her because she is able to, open up to Tendi and actually become friends with Tendi. And I really like that character growth. And then the same thing from Tendi. She is someone who just like thinks so much of others that she rarely lets other people see her, which, by the way, I could not relate to more. Definitely have had that problem where I just overcare and don't allow people to get to know me. That's sort of definitely a problem I feel. So I just the more I learn about Tendi, the more I love her and identify with her so heavily. So heavens, I love Tendi so much, and I like that sort of character growth and recognition from her that she's, able to open up to Mariner. But then the episode ends with Mariner sort of to hide the fact that under Tendi's charge, the scratching post got broken, that she crashes the shuttle into the ship, gets herself thrown in the brig and says, there was a bee on the shuttle. And it's like, how is there a bee in space? Says Ransom, which is a good little bit. But then she gives the scratching post to Anna, and Anna's like, I don't care about the scratching post, I just want the box. Which is great because cats love being in boxes. Don't you get it? We get it. It was a good bit. So that brings us to the end of the episode where we have the little wrap-up scene where everyone sort of has their closing moments with Mariner in the brig, and Rutherford's like traumatized, and Boimler's like, I'm gonna go meet Tom Paris to get a drinks to the bar, but then he runs into the wall and he thinks he might have a concussion. And Mariner and Tendi recognize that they've sort of hung out together and have grown as people. Good little wrap-out scene, sort of standard sort of bit. Overall, like I said, while I did not love the Rutherford sequence's ending, I don't hate it. Everything else within this episode I thought was like great meta commentary, had great character dynamics, great character growth for all of these people, really funny, good cameos by a classic Star Trek actor and Robert Duncan McNeil. Honestly, so far this episode was probably, despite my criticisms here and there, I think this was probably my favorite episode of the season. One other thing that I did want to mention though, in the sequence where Mariner is on the Orion sequence, as I mentioned in my spoiler-free section, we learn that Mariner is officially bisexual, which is amazing. Get confirmation of a main character in Star Trek being officially bisexual, pansexual. She doesn't necessarily say it, but she says she's attracted to men, women, non-binary folks, and aliens. Again, I've already talked about all that. One small criticism that I just want to toss out there about that, and it's a nuanced thing, is like, I really appreciate that Mariner is bisexual. I really appreciate that she mentions non-binary people in that attraction. Absolutely wonderful. And I'm using bisexual as a catch-all, so I don't mean to erase pansexual people. I know there's people, some have the distinction. But it's essentially attraction to all genders, including non-binary folks. That's awesome. One thing I will note, though, is we've really only seen Mariner be attracted to masculine-presenting people. So, like, she references this guy's abs way back in the season 1 premiere. She, like, had the holodeck program where it was, like, a bunch of buff naked dudes. Really funny stuff. Don't get me wrong. I am also, as a bisexual person, I am also attracted to dudes with abs and things like that, and biceps. Makes sense to me. And I don't necessarily mean to say that, like, a character showing attraction to only men means that it erases their bisexualness. I'm not trying to say bi erasure, but it does kind of bring back sort of echoes of what happened with the show Loki there, where there's a verbal reference to the character of Loki, and now Mariner being bisexual or pansexual, if you will, but that not actually being displayed within the show. Like, Mariner is someone who has had ample chances to, like, she's clearly has a big libido of some sort, and yet we don't really ever see her hitting on women. Again, I'm not saying that this to say, like, anyone who, like, women who are attracted to masculine presenting people are not bisexual. Clearly they still are, myself including in that, but it does worry me that, like, there's this show, it's another sort of trope of, like, shows being like, the character's bisexual, but we're only going to show them having attraction in straight passing ways, quote unquote, in straight passing ways there. Sort of having their cake and eating it too, like saying we get the representation points without actually backing it up with, like, showing that sort of actual attraction on screen. Again, it's not something awful. I'm not saying do this to bi erase anybody or anything like that, or to do that sort of thing, but it would be something nice within the show if, like, maybe in a few episodes or next season or whatever, Mariner shows like, oh yeah, this girl's hot too, and actually not just as a joke, but actually like being like, oh, I'm attracted to this girl, just to sort of like show that she does have that range of sexual attraction to people, or even romantic attraction. Also, I like the reference to that, the fact that she's not interested in Boimler at all, which is great. I don't want to see a more Boimler Mariner thing here going on with the show, so I'm glad that that was sort of like kind of nixed within the show. But again, maybe it was character doth protest too much. Maybe she is into Boimler, but I like that. Hopefully that was sort of the end. I'm like, no, she's not interested in Boimler. So that's my sort of criticism of that side of things. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't bring up that criticism. Again, it's an ongoing conversation. It's not a condemnation. It's a sort of like, oh, I offer this up as a thought to you, the viewer, to sort of think about when it comes to bisexual representation. But overall, great episode. Loved it. I love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. Don't forget I have a Patreon page that you can help support me at. But that being said, I hope that you all live long and prosper.